Welcome to the webinar, Getting Started with CI/CD for NetSuite. A little bit about myself. My name is Scott Dixon. I'm a customer engineer here at Salto. I'm based in New York, and I help our customers onboard and implement Salto into their ongoing change management process for NetSuite, as well as a number of other business applications that Salto supports, like Salesforce, Okta, Zendesk, Jira, and a couple others. Looking forward to getting started. And here's the agenda for today's webinar. First, we're going to cover what is CI/CD, or continuous integration and continuous deployment. What are the challenges that CI/CD can help with NetSuite teams? What are the specific benefits that NetSuite teams could see by implementing CI/CD into their change management process? What are some of the CI/CD tools that are available? And then we'll go into a demo about how a CI/CD pipeline can be set up using Salto. And then at the end, we'll leave some room for any questions. And if you do have any questions as they come up, please put them in the Q&A section, or there's also a chat, and we'll try to address them during the presentation. And then, of course, I'll leave some time at the end for some questions. And please don't be shy, ask away. We'd love to hear your thoughts, any questions that you might have. And if we don't happen to get to your question during the webinar, we'll take note and make sure we reach out after the session. And then also, just as a kind of housekeeping, we're going to be recording this webinar and we'll make it available on our website later. So let's get started. So what is CI/CD? So CI/CD, or continuous integration and continuous deployment, these are tools and practices that provide developers with the means to automate portions of the development lifecycle. These are common in the software development space, but less common for some business applications. A CI, or continuous integration, these are the automated tests and validations for small changes before merging them to higher environments, continuously integrating these changes. And CD, or continuous deployment, this is the automated delivery of approved changes to higher environments. And then one word you might hear throughout this webinar is pipeline. And pipeline is the top level component of CI/CD. A pipeline comprises of jobs and stages. For example, we might have a production stage with a job called deploy to prod. And I'll make sure to cover this when we show a demo of how you set up a pipeline in Salto. So as we get started, I thought it would be interesting to share some context to how CI/CD helps organizations move faster by looking at some stats of how common CI/CD is among high-performing organizations. Now, this all comes from the State of DevOps 2022 report. I recommend reading the entire report, but there were a couple parts that I wanted to really focus on that show a correlation between adopting CI/CD and achieving the goals that high-achieving organizations set for themselves. So in this context, when I say high-performing organizations, those are organizations that can deploy changes more often, on demand, sometimes several times per day. High-performing organizations can deploy faster. They get code into production in sometimes under a week. For high-performing organizations, it takes less time for them to recover, often less than a day to restore a service that was impacted by an outage. And the overall rate of change errors for these high-performing organizations, which is the percentage of times that their changes lead to degraded services for end users, is low. It's less than 15% according to the study. So knowing what the context of a high performer is and what these high-performing organizations see in terms of results, let's take a look at how CI/CD is part of that success. So for high performers, 33% are more likely to use version control. That is, they're saving versions of their software, of their configurations over time, so that they can see it for documentation purposes, as well as for reverting or rolling back to previous versions. 39% of high-performing organizations are more likely to use CI. And this is because the continuous integration process provides quick, automated feedback, and this gives organizations more confidence in the changes that are being shipped. And 46% are more likely to practice continuous deployment. And this is because the continuous deployment allows teams to deliver code to production faster, and they have shorter lead time for changes and a faster time to recovery in case of an outage. So knowing the success that some organizations see by adopting CI/CD, let's review some of the challenges for NetSuite teams that can be directly addressed with CI/CD. So one challenge is the time-consuming manual promotion process. Many deployment tasks that are testing, approvals, merging are very manual for a lot of NetSuite teams, and this increases the risk of errors. Having a successful deployment requires a lot of time, a lot of manual checking, a lot of effort to ensure that changes are error-free. Another challenge is limited collaboration. NetSuite admins and developers will deploy to the same environments, but a lot of times they're using different tools and methodologies, which in turn means that they might have little visibility into each other's work, and that can result in misalignment of the environments themselves and errors when deploying to live production environments. Another challenge is inefficient testing. If you're doing manual deployments, many times there's very limited testing or manual testing, and this means that issues are not found until the changes are actually deployed, making them much harder to debug, much harder to roll back. Another challenge is around merge conflicts. Integrating changes and code from multiple contributors can be a really tedious and complex process that ultimately adds to the time that it takes to deploy changes. And then another challenge can be a lack of an approval process. So when changes are deployed into production without a standardized approval process, this can increase the risk that something might break when you push it to production. So now that we've covered some of the challenges in NetSuite that CI/CD can help to address, what are some of the benefits from adopting CI/CD? One is it's going to allow a smoother collaboration between developers and admins. There's going to be more visibility into each other's changes, less errors in production. The second is around being able to automate work that would otherwise have to be done manually. And then the third is around deploying higher quality customizations faster with less risk of breaking something in your production environment. And then another big benefit is being able to detect issues early on when they're small and fixable. So before we get into some of the specifics about setting up a CI/CD pipeline, who is CI/CD good for? And note that if your organization doesn't meet these qualifications now, it doesn't mean you won't meet them in the future. And it's always good to think about how to future-proof your NetSuite strategy as your organization scales. So if you're already leveraging source control for your Suite scripts, or if your process includes or you'd like to include code reviews, approvals, automated tests, or code linting, CI/CD might be good to start taking a look at. As well as if you have a high volume of NetSuite changes, as well as a high number of contributors, especially if those contributors are both on the admin and developer side. And then also if you have a large or complex code base. And again, just because your organization doesn't meet these now, doesn't mean you won't in the future. And to give you an idea of some of the specific tasks that can be done with CI/CD, here's a few examples. Automatically updating, validating, and deploying code when a feature branch is merged, or validating code with a linter prior to deployment, running automated testing before deployment, and then preventing that code from being deployed if any of the tests come back as failing. Automatically updating an issue or a ticket in your tracking system when the code review status has been updated. So these are all examples, as well as there are more types of tasks that you can achieve with CI/CD. Now, what does in terms of a CI/CD pipeline with NetSuite, I want to cover what the components what would entail. So some of the components that are going to be necessary for any CI/CD pipeline. One of the first is going to be SDF, or the Suite Cloud Development Framework. This is used to track and deploy NetSuite customizations. If you're familiar with SDF, it allows you to pull down most of your configurations. You can then deploy them as code across your environments. The second component will be a Git repository. This is used for version control. Another component is going to be the actual CI tool itself. The CI tool is going to be the tool that orchestrates the testing, the development, and the deployment of your changes. And then part of that is going to be the testing framework and the helper scripts that you choose to use. This is used to test the changes and assist with making those incremental changes over time. Now I'd like to introduce Salto CI/CD. So Salto CI/CD is specifically for empowering NetSuite teams to collaborate and deliver changes in one centralized pipeline. So you could reduce errors, release faster. Now, the great thing about Salto CI/CD is that your developers can continue using the exact same tools and processes. So for example, using SDF and VS Code or other command line or IDEs, while having full visibility into admin, what the admins are doing. Now, taking a step back, I just want to review a little bit about what Salto is in case you're not familiar. So Salto, we're a universal DevOps solution for managing the configuration of business applications. We allow both administrators and developers to work together to turn their error-prone workflows into an automated workflow. So some of the applications that we work with are listed here: NetSuite, Salesforce, Zendesk, Okta, Jira, and so on. So it allows all of your business application teams to work in one place. Now, in terms of how you would set up a CI/CD pipeline with Salto, these are going to be the specific components that you would need. Now, there are going to be three major components here. First is going to be obviously Salto. Now, Salto is going to be used to track and deploy the NetSuite customizations. Now, earlier, I'd mentioned that SDF is going to be a really important part of managing the NetSuite customizations. Salto is actually using SDF, as well as we also use a customized Salto Suite app that allows us to work with your customizations, not only an additional set of customizations, but we can work with customizations in a way that SDF may not allow you to. And then a Git repository. So Salto can work with any major Git provider: GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps. For the demo today, I'm going to be using GitHub, but just keep in mind, we can work with any Git provider. And then a CI tool. So this is going to be one of the strengths of Salto, is that we're going to hook into any existing external CI provider and be able to use it to orchestrate the testing, development, and deployment. And Salto can be the actual tool to run the deployments, and the external CI tool is where a lot of the logic can use in terms of the custom checks that are running, the automated testing frameworks. It can be leveraged with any of those testing frameworks or helper scripts. Now, for today's example, I'm going to use GitHub Actions as my CI tool. But again, it can work with any external CI provider: GitLab CI, Jenkins, and so on. All right, so let's jump into a demo. So for today's demo, just to kind of set the stage, I'm going to be showing how both your developers and admins can work together in a single pipeline. And I'm going to start by showing how a developer's work can be implemented and deployed. All right. So first up, let me just kind of take a step back. And what I'd like to show is in my SDF repository, I, as a developer, I've been using SDF to track changes. And I'm going to push some changes that I've been making to some scripts up to my higher environments. Now, this is something that your developers could be doing outside of Salto. This is something that's available with the native SDF CLI tools. Your developers could be using something like a VS Code to actually be making and committing these changes. Now for today's example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a really simple change to a Sweet script just to show you how that can be done using Salto. So here I'm removing some debug lines, kind of cleaning up some of this code. And I'm going to be merging those changes from a feature branch in my Git repository to the main branch that represents my production environment. Now, with this SDF repo, what I've done is as soon as I've opened up this pull request, it's going to open up a deployment in Salto. How I'm able to do that is if I jump into specifically how I set this up with GitHub Actions, is that I've set up a job to run that every single time a pull request is opened, it's going to take those changes, analyze those changes, and then push it up to Salto as a deployment, and then Salto can carry on that deployment to run. Now, if I go back to my pull request, here I can see that this job has already run. If I look at all the checks, now I could also run additional custom checks here. Here's where you would run any testing frameworks, any code linting, and maybe have it only open up that deployment in Salto after it runs. Now, if I go back to Salto, now I'm in my first sandbox environment. And I, as maybe a deployment manager or release manager, I could come in and see that one of my developers created a pull request in that repo, which opened up a deployment in Salto. Now, if I come into the Salto deployment, here I can see the specific changes that are being made. In this case, these are those exact same changes that are being made to that Sweet script. And then I can move forward with the deployment process. Now, here's where really Salto is going to take over and carry on with the deployment process. And we're going to do that by integrating into our own deployment pipeline. So let me show you how we're going to do that. So in Salto, it's going to open up another pull request. And this pull request, if I open up GitHub here, is going to show those exact same changes that are being made. And this is where we're going to integrate those changes into the higher environment and follow the exact same workflow that admins would be checking. Now, in this case, this pull request, it's going to be opened up in a separate Git repo. This is also a Git repo that could be hosted in the same Git organization that your SDF repos are being hosted. But what this repo is doing is going to be tracking all the changes that are being done, both by developers and admins, as well as directly in your NetSuite environments. Whereas your SDF repos would probably be only tracking the changes that your developers are working on. Now here I could place additional logic that sets up additional customs checks to run. It could set up additional code linting, code testing, and only after those checks run would that deployment move forward with Salto. Now in this case, what I've done is I've just created some simple branch protection rule that says that any merging of these branches requires someone to come in and approve these changes. So again, this is really up to the needs of your organization to create this process. You could have a custom check run, and only after that custom check runs, then it maybe sends out a request for an approval. And after that approval runs, that's when that deployment could run within Salto. So if I come back to Salto here, so let's say that we've already pushed these changes into my first sandbox environment, and I'm ready to then promote those changes up to my production environment. So in Salto, this is as easy as coming to the compare and deploy. And just for demonstration purposes, I've got a similar deployment that I've done, and I could go to that same deployment and choose to deploy that to a new target environment. So it would take the scope of those changes, and you could select, for example, my production environment, and take those same set of changes and then promote them up through, create a deployment in Salto, and move forward through the process. So let me show you what that is going to look like. If I go to my production environment, I can see the list of changes, or sorry, the list of deployments that are being planned. And if I go into this deployment, these are those same changes that would have been promoted to that lower environment. And now we're saying, let's go ahead and take that same scope and move that up the pipeline. Now, once you move this up the pipeline, you can set those automation rules to run. You can set additional custom checks to run. Now you can also select multiple past deployments and promote them in a single deployment to production. So let's say that you have a number of deployments, maybe daily deployments to your integration environment, but only one deployment per week of changes from your integration to your production environment. You could come here within Salto, select all of the past changes that have been pushed into your integration environment, and then push those up to your production environment. So this is how the changes from your developers coming from SDF would be promoted from the lower environments into the higher environments. And again, your admins would also have visibility into all those changes that are being made in the environments. But what if you also want to pull in changes that are coming from your admins? Your admins might be making changes directly in a sandbox environment, maybe to workflows, adding a custom record, adding a new field, updating a transaction form. So they're making these changes directly in a sandbox environment, and they want to push those changes up to a higher environment. I'm going to walk you through how an admin would make these changes and how they would be integrated the exact same way into the higher environments. So in Salto, if I come through, I would open up a new comparison. And here I would select in Salto the source environment, that being the environment where I created those changes or updates, to the target environment where I'm pushing those changes to. And I would give it a title, add new workflow. Now, something both your developers and admins can do within Salto is that if you're using something like Jira, ServiceNow, Freshservice, whatever you're using for your ticketing system, you could come in and add that ticket ID. So for example, this is my ticket ID about creating this new workflow. And I'm going to be able to track all the changes related to that ticket to whatever deployment in Salto. So when your admins create a deployment within Salto, it's going to immediately show you all of the differences in between those two environments. This can be really helpful for your admins to understand what are all the changes that are sitting there in your lower environments that need to be pushed up to your higher environments. So if I look at my comparison here, it's showing all the changes that would be necessary to get my production in line with my sandbox environment. Now, because these are a lot of changes, I'm going to go ahead and filter to show only the changes that I'm interested in, which are the changes to my workflows. And I already know the name. It's called Create New Op. So I could come in, select my workflow, and it's going to flag any required dependencies. So in this case, this workflow depends on a save search. So I'm going to select the save search for deployment. And as I select more elements to deploy, Salto is going to flag any missing dependencies. And I'm going to jump over here and clear my filter so I can see all the changes. And I've also got this particular custom field that would need to be added. And now I've got everything that I need to go ahead and deploy as an admin. I've developed this workflow in my sandbox environment, and now I'm ready to get everything pushed to production. Now, as I create this deployment preview, now you're going to see how this comes in line with my deployment pipeline as it relates to my developers. This is going to open up a pull request in our Git repo that's tracking all of the changes. And it's going to be able to run any of the custom checks. It's going to be subject to the approval process, just like all the changes that are coming through from a developer. And as soon as this deployment preview ends, we'll be able to get a link to that pull request, which let's go ahead and look at it right now. It's going to show all the changes that are part of this particular pull request and allow you to apply any of those logics coming from your custom checks coming from whatever external CI provider that you're using. So in GitHub, I've created a branch protection rule that requires someone to come in and approve these changes. You could instead, again, have a custom check running just to make sure that, if changes are coming from these type of configurations, maybe only updates to workflows need an approval process. But let me just go ahead and quickly approve these changes so I can show you what this will look like. All right, so after this flow is approved, this is going to run automatically and push those changes directly into my production environment. And I'll be able to see those changes reflected in my deployment history. And now I'll be able to see all of my deployments, all of my deployments coming from both administrators and developers in that same space. Now, let's say that you wanted to pull those changes, both coming from developers and admins up into those higher environments. This is where you would come into Salto, select your previous deployments, and be able to push those into production. So I see there's a couple changes, or sorry, a couple of questions in the chat. So let me go ahead and answer a couple of these. Fred, are your environments maintained as branches? That's a great question. So the environments in Salto are going to be reflected in a couple of different ways. So if I go to my Git repo that represents my entire NetSuite environment, I've got a branch here that represents each of those individual environments. So this is the repo, the Git repo in Salto that's going to represent all of the changes, not just the changes coming from developers, but also coming from admins. And Salto is going to update these branches as we see changes being made. This is something that's going to be done automatically, does not need to be maintained by either your developers or admins. Now, if we take a look at my SDF repo, this is where, and now you could use whatever strategy you want. One that we recommend is using like a feature branching strategy, where each environment, or sorry, the production environment is going to be represented by the main branch. And as you open up features that need to be added up throughout the environments, you'd open up a specific feature branch for that, merge those changes, and then deploy from Salto. And then I got a question from Brian about how will this help prevent deployment loss with a sandbox refresh? Will allow us to create a backup in the case of a refresh so you don't lose your current work? It's a great question. So when you come into the compare and deploy screen with Salto, Salto is going to show you all of the changes that have not been pushed over from your sandbox environment. Salto is also going to allow you to create kind of a configuration backup over time of your sandbox environment by pushing those changes up to that Git repo that tracks all of the changes that are going on. So just in case, so one, I guess, kind of two ways. One thing is that before you do a sandbox refresh, we recommend coming into Salto, doing a comparison between those two environments, so you can confirm which of your configurations have not been moved from one environment, from sandbox environment to for the production environment. And then second, because Salto is going to be keeping a backup of your configurations using Git, you will have access to those configurations just in case they get deleted during the refresh. Got a question from Christopher about how does Salto handle dependencies? Let's say you create a workflow and a search that relies on sandbox-only dependencies. Can you automatically import them? So the way that we're going to do that in Salto is, let me actually just go back to this workflow, is that as you select elements for deployment, Salto, because it does understand the dependencies, where different fields are being used, what a safe search depends on. As you select those, Salto is also going to cross-reference what exists and what doesn't exist in the target environment. So for example, if you create a workflow that relies on maybe a field that only exists in your sandbox environment and has not been pushed to your production environment, Salto is going to flag that as a missing dependency during the deployment flow. Got a question from Hanan about, can we roll back our changes that we made to the target environment? Yes, you can. So let me go ahead and show actually how that can be done using Salto. So in Salto, when you create a comparison in the UI, you've got a couple different options. One is choosing where that if you want to deploy those changes from a source like a sandbox environment. But then also, every single time that you do a deployment through Salto, it's going to save a snapshot of your environment that's going to represent the state of your environment at the time of the deployment. And so what that will allow you to do is, as you run deployments through Salto, you'll be able to select a snapshot of that previous environment during that time of the deployment, create a new comparison, and then you can restore the specific values that were present at that time. So for example, in the demo where I deployed the workflow that has the dependency on the safe search in that field, let's say that I deploy those changes, and in doing so, I accidentally update my safe search instead of deploying a new safe search. I could come back and say, remove that workflow and also undo those changes I made to the safe search, but maybe keep the changes that I made to that specific field. So Salto is going to allow you to granularly pick and choose which of those elements that you want to roll back to. It's worth noting that this rollback functionality can be a little bit difficult to achieve using SDF alone, because of how SDF won't allow you kind of out of the box to be able to remove a type. So for example, if I deploy a change, let's say I deploy a safe search that depends on a particular field, and I want to roll back all of those changes. So I want to roll back the changes I made to that safe search. I also want to remove that field. That's something that can be a little bit difficult to do with SDF, which is why we built a Suite app on top of SDF within Salto that allows us to also remove types, allow you to achieve rollbacks. And got another question about, can Salto work around circular dependencies in SDF? That's a great question. It's certainly something that Salto can help with. During the deployment process, we allow you to kind of remove or add those dependencies manually by editing the underlying files. There are some circular dependencies that we've completely worked around. There's still ones that we might run into during the deployment process. But I guess it really depends on which type that we're running into that circular dependency. And got another question from John. Can you roll back only the last deployment, or can you roll back a deployment, I believe maybe three deployments after? So if you can see here in the UI where I've selected my deployment, as you do deployments with Salto, it is going to save a snapshot of that environment every single time. So you can choose over time, it's going to show the snapshot as well as the name of that deployment. So it's not just the last deployment, but any deployment that you've been doing with Salto. So we still got a little bit of time if you've got any questions. I wanted to also kind of come back and show a couple other features of Salto. Since I kind of went directly into the deployment process, ones that I think might be interesting for you all to see. And if I go to my Salto environment here, one thing to note is that Salto is going to show you kind of impact analysis or understanding the risk of making a change in your production environment by allowing you to see where all those configurations are being used. So if I go into, for example, my workflows, I can see a particular new workflow that I created, and then Salto is going to show me here at the bottom where that this workflow depends on the safe search, and it's going to, if I click on the safe search, it's going to show me where those dependencies on that safe search are coming from, as well as where that safe search is being used. Now, this is that same information that's being used during the deployment process to analyze for any potential missing dependencies. Now, one thing to note is that Salto is also going to track dependencies coming from a Suite script. So let's say you have a Suite script that you developed and it has a dependency on a field that only exists in your sandbox environment. Not only is Salto going to show you this in the UI, but during the deployment process, if you try to deploy that Suite script that has that dependency, we're going to flag that you also need to add either this custom or standard field to the target environment. Another question from John about how is code testing being done? So that's a great question. So code testing is going to be done as part of whatever external CI provider that you choose to use. So for example, with GitHub Actions, if I go back to Salto here, you can create a custom check within GitHub Actions that's going to run a job to test for not only you can use any sort of a testing suite that comes for Suite script, but you could also create custom test scripts yourself to test for, making sure that links don't 404 when you link out to them, or whatever sort of custom check that you'd like to run. This is kind of the beauty of integrating with an external CI provider, is that you'll be able to run whatever checks that you would like directly within the external CI platform. And Salto is going to only do that deployment after the checks succeed. What testing tools have you worked with in NetSuite? So we've got actually a couple of recommendations. We have a blog post that I'll make sure that we get you a link to after the call that mentions some specific testing frameworks that are really useful to work with for NetSuite. And with that, I've covered the majority of what I wanted to cover here today. So if there are any questions, I'm available. But that kind of wraps up the intro to CI/CD in terms of from a Salto perspective, how to set up a Salto CI/CD pipeline. And we're going to make a recording of this presentation available later. And also, we'll make sure to follow up for any of the questions, like your question about the testing script. Hanan added another question. Does Salto store data inside NetSuite to their external system? So Salto is just going to be looking at the metadata coming from your NetSuite environments. So this is information about custom records, forms, fields, but none of the actual data. Salto is not going to pull in to either manage or deploy any actual data. To be able to work with Salto, Salto kind of requires two components. One is that we integrate directly with SDF. So it's just making sure that your environments have SDF enabled. And then we have a custom Suite app that would need to be installed on any of the environments where we're fetching or deploying those changes to. Brian asked, can you show the screen that we would see all the projects that are currently in process and the state that they're in? Yes, so Brian, if I come back to, for example, my production environment, I'm going to see the history as well as the kind of status of all of the deployments that are in play. Now, these are going to be in 3 parts. These are only showing 2 right now because no deployment is actively running. But if we did have any deployments that were actively running, in other words, either in the middle of planning or in the middle of actually deploying to the target environment, they would show up here at the top. Now, under planning, these would show any deployments that are kind of queued up for deployment. And if you are using Salto CI/CD, it would also show the related pull request. So you could go directly into the related pull request, which I can do right here, and you can see the status right here. Now, the other thing to note is that if you are leveraging a ticket system like Jira, ServiceNow, you can also integrate the kind of ticket ID, the get to ticket integration, which could then also update your ticketing system to update you that, hey, this pull request has just been opened related to this ticket. And if you have some sort of manual approval process, or if if the check fails. You can also update that ticket directly, so you can come directly into this pull request and see what might have went wrong. And then at the very bottom, it's going to show the history of all of the deployments that have happened either to this environment, as also to and from this environment. This is where you could go in and I could go in and see the exact changes that were being made. I could also select any of these past deployments. So you could select multiple past deployments to deploy those changes to. This is really helpful if you have like an integration environment where you're pushing changes frequently to those environments from lower environments. And then you wanted to kind of bundle up all of those changes that are happening to the integration environment and then deploy them to production in one go. And I'm available for any other questions if you have them. And also, I'm going to find that blog link while there are no questions to make sure I can get you all that information about some of the testing framework. Oh, Anna beat me to it. If you check out the chat, there's a really great blog post all about NetSuite for CI/CD for NetSuite in Salto, and in that we mention a couple testing suites that we recommend taking a look at. And if you are interested in learning more, I'm going to also jump in, pop in a link to our website with a little bit more about our NetSuite solution. It's got some information if you want to request a custom demo, get started with our free tier, as well as we have a free trial to get started. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on, we have a live in-app chat where you can talk to our support team. Another question from Hanan. What about developers who are working on SCA customizations? Do you have any functionality to keep up changes made to SCA websites? Hanan, that's a great question. Do you mind if I get back to that? I'm going to take note and I will get back to you over email. I don't want to give you the wrong answer. And if there's no other questions, I'll probably cut off the webinar here in a couple minutes. But again, I'm available if there are any other questions. And thanks again for everyone joining. Really great questions. I'm glad that I had a really active Q&A today.